This is a preview of a novel I'm writing. The novel's called Light Ascending. It's a story you probably know, but it's told in a very different way. The prologue. 8 days had passed, and the little one cried out, screaming to the point that all around him thought he might not breathe again. Then a deep, jagged gasp rose up from the little baby's being, and air finally refilled his lungs. Joseph wiped the bloodied knife. The tiny circle of flesh was scooped up by one of the women present. She placed the pink spot in a bottle of oil and sealed it. Mary was crying too. She picked up her son and held him close to her heart, hoping he would latch onto her bosom. The tiny boy quietened almost immediately, and he snuggled into the warmth and love of his mother. Mary breathed gently again too, for it was like their breaths had become singular throughout the whole ordeal, and her little one seemed to sense this union, as they both found calm. Together their hearts became synchronized, as the thump, thump, thump inside both of them slowed. Jesus surrendered to painless sleep. Mary found her smile at last. Joseph looked on. He did not expect to feel such tenderness at this moment. It was the measure of his own manliness that he began to take into his sphere the idea of softening his gaze upon the world. Love reigned throughout his soul and his earthly body. For the first time since the panic of their son's birth, he too fell into a more serene space. It was as if the small family had opened the door to what felt like perfect harmony. Life encircled the three of them inside the darkened cave. Light Ascending, Part 1, Mary. Anna and Joachim had built their home in the wealthy city of Sepphoris. It was a place in transition, however, being torn apart by the Roman occupation. The relics of the past were being razed and new structures put in place. The city had long prospered, but now it was undergoing a Roman transition. All would see the glory of Rome was all over the empire. Legions of military now swarmed the streets. The old rule was totally being usurped, and the Jewish townspeople began to feel that God had forgotten them, or worse, judged them. Joachim and Anna had always done well there, and they set out to do God's will, working within the rules of both the Romans and the Holy Temple. They paid what taxes they were billed. Joachim often gave food and money to the poor, and Anna was also kind, pure of mind and spirit. They had longed for children, but God had not favoured them with any. Now, they were too old. The new rulers in the town of Sepphoris had overtaken the government. It made the church fellows more aware of their own mistakes, for surely God was handing down punishment for the city, which had become largely God-forsaken. So they became even more severe in their reading of the law. Some in the church establishment, though, took note of these new ways. 1, people were made to pay their taxes. And 2, if you wanted to get around a law, it didn't quite fit, there were bribes to pay, extra sacrifices to be given. God was telling these good people to become more like their Roman counterparts. One day, when Joachim offered some cattle and doubled the required amount in gold, the sacrifice was queried by members of the church council. God has shown his discontent with this barren couple. The church should now banish the two as unclean in the eyes of God. Unless, of course, Joachim tripled the required amount of gold. This beguiled him. The sacrifice he had offered was already twice the amount in gold. He felt repelled. He didn't want God to think him cheap, but he also knew what they were now asking was completely unfair. He had been fortunate and wise, saving for his and his wife's later years, and being without sons to help the business, the amount they were now asking would seriously jeopardise their future. Not all the synagogue elders were of the same mind, of course, but the church sorely needed some renovations. to keep up the grand architecture that was being transposed in Sepphoris. So many of the elders just turned a blind eye. If you want to live in this expensive city, then you had to up your ante. Whatever the pair had done, let them heal the wound themselves. It was so upsetting to Joachim that he felt compelled to take leave of the city to commune with God in a much less confusing place. Anna watched from the upstairs window as Joachim walked away from their house in the city of Sepphoris. The temple laws had judged them both. Her empty womb made her somehow unholy. She wiped away the tears as Joachim became a brown figure amongst other brown figures. The house around her, empty rooms that seemed to negate her presence. Many, many days passed. Anna was left alone in a city that now deplored her. She hid her face and hurried whenever she made short trips to the market. She spent most of her time praying on her knees, looking out a bright window facing east. She loved watching the sun's light slowly fill the hallway where they had placed an altar. As she prayed, she asked God to bless them with a child, even though she knew her body had already missed that opportunity. Joachim left his wife, travelled far into the desert, where he fasted and prayed and prayed and prayed. As his body emptied, his mind eventually let go of the pain of hunger. And as his body adjusted to this emptiness, his mind became attuned to the dryness around him. His being seemed to melt into the desert, and he disappeared into the environment. There was no longer a Joachim, no longer a desert, no longer a sin, no longer a breath. He became a nothingness within the all. He existed but didn't exist at the same time. His prayers, full of thankfulness and love, became a glow in the desert. Life in this lifeless place. Words fell away. Thoughts calmed and receded. Light instead became his force. You will have a child. It was like the whole world and the heavens above all landed inside him in a tiny point of his knowingness. A voice clear and deep, surrounded by the most brilliant, luminous serenity. An angel flowered inside his human heart. He suddenly became conscious of its body. The voice trembled inside his own body. You will have a child. She will be pure of spirit and free from darkness. This begins a new way. Go back to Anna now. Joachim's invisibility ended abruptly. He was kneeling in the sand, with hot sunlight filling the fibres of his robe. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way from lack of blood flow. He fell back to the ground, and laughter replaced his incoherence, like a staircase leading back to his human form. Anna waited at the town's gates. For she, too, had been visited by an angel who called himself Gabriel. He announced himself and then spoke with a single message, just 5 words. You will have a child. When the light dissolved into the blankness of the empty room around her, she was filled with a joy she had never known. The glare of the day seemed infinite outside the town walls. From inside the gates, Anna stood in the shade looking out towards the desert. Like a wobbling mirage, a figure slowly came into focus. And she just knew instantly it was her husband. She made a few steps outside the gates. Joachim saw her too then. And even though a tiredness has ultimately begun to weaken his step, he found the energy to run. When they collided, love embraced them both. And they felt like one person with one heart. For a first birth, there was little pain. It seemed like heaven had transmuted itself inside the bedroom, and it surrounded the women present. A baby shone its light into the world for the first time. They named the child Mary. She was their miracle, and they knew that Mary belonged to God. She would be kept away from all that could tarnish her selfhood. It was the couple's duty to help her remain pure in spirit. Love and glorious light would always be in Mary's aura. She grew into a kind and joyful toddler. Joachim and Anna's house was always full of laughter from her conception. They had written a contract in their own hearts, though. Mary belonged to God. Mary belonged to God. Mary belonged to God. This mantra filled their every waking moment. Then one day, the word God fell away momentarily and was replaced. Both of them heard it. Mary belonged to the church. This was a sign they'd been strangely expecting. They took young Mary to the synagogue, where she was taken to another house. Here, there were many other girls who were kept away from the sins of the world to give service to both the church and to God. No evil would ever penetrate those walls. No human negativity or dark thoughts could arrive there at all. Mary grew into a young girl, and she eventually lost memory of her parents. She cleaned. She learnt to cook. She wove splendid fabrics that were used inside the church. Life became largely silent. Words were kept to a minimum there, so that even language could not spoil any of the girls. They never felt like prisoners in their tiny unlit cells. None of them knew any different. So when they joined in songs and prayed in unison, this became their joy, the focal points of each and every day. Mary lived for God, and God was always with her. So when one day in her 12th year, she woke up feeling unwell, she did not know what was happening. There on the bed was a small patch of dark redness, drops of blood seeping into the fabric of the mattress. She quickly took some muslin and tried to wipe up the wet stain. These moments filled her with something she'd not known before. It was something she did not have a name for. She had heard the word doubt in some prayers, but she did not totally equate these feelings with that word. It was as if the day was no longer full of daylight, the night no longer the absence of day. The little red splotch opened a door of something not known to her. It came from her physical body without any of her own personal intent. It shaped a new idea in her mind. It called to her and broke apart the perfectness of all the moments she had ever willfully lived. One day she would have a name for it, but not now. It was a cloud blocking the sun. It was rain, misting over starlight. It was a forgotten verse in a song not yet known. One day she would call it uncertainty.